In the previous video, I started the concept of a purchasing power parity or PPP. And the examples I used was under the absolute form of a PPP. So the absolute PPP refers that prices of the same basket of products or just one single product in two different countries should be equal when measured in common currency. So under absolute form PPP, $1 can buy you a burger in US. If you convert it to Japanese yen, it can still buy you one burger, not more, not less, in Japan. So this is the absolute form of PPP. Well, in reality, the situation might violate this absolute form. Like the Norwegian krone is overvalued by 90%, and Malaysia ringgit is undervalued by 10%. Hong Kong dollar is undervalued by 45%. If the over undervaluation exists, then in the absolute form PPP, it should be corrected. Okay, it should be corrected. How could that correct? Through exchange rate. So let me just write this up. Absolute PPP. All right, and let me use the Japan as an example. So in Japan, one burger is 1 Japanese yen, and in US is $1. And the PPP rate based on these two prices would be $1 over 100 Japanese yen. So that's gonna give us $0.01 per yen. And if the absolute PPP holds, then we know that the actual rate is 0.01% per yen as well. So the PPP rate equals to the actual rate. What about if there's inflation involved? If the prices in the two countries change? Let's say if US has 10% inflation, okay? The US inflation is 10%, and the Japanese inflation is 0%. Okay, they had a deflation situation for like 2 decades. If that's the case, then you would see that the dollar price would change to $1.1, and the yen's price would still remains at 100 yen. And then if you calculate the PPP rate, you would exchange the old price with the new price, and that's gonna make your exchange rate equals to $0.011 per yen. Okay, so if the actual rate adjusted to the price level, let's say if the actual rate also changed to the $0.011 per yen, then the absolute form of a PPP still holds. All right. Okay, what about if it doesn't change? If it doesn't change, then the actual rate is lower than the PPP rate, so that means the Japanese yen is undervalued. If still the actual rate is $0.01 yen, and you know it's less than the PPP rate, the new PPP rate, if its actual rate does not change, then yen is undervalued. So that's a violation of the absolute form of PPP. So let me just call it a violation, absolute form of a PPP. Okay, and right here, we know that the situation like this exists in a lot of countries like China, like India, like Poland, Norway, or Switzerland. It's just a matter of how much the currency is overvalued or undervalued. And we don't see this actual exchange rate always equal to the purchasing power parity rate. But still, there's another form of a purchasing power parity. We call it relative PPP. All right. So the relative PPP basically says that due to market imperfections like shipping cost and transaction cost, prices of the same basket of product in different countries will not necessarily be the same. So they recognize that the price level in two places, although measured in common currency like US dollar, is different. Let's say $1 has twice more purchasing power in China, but half purchasing power in Norway. And under this relative form of PPP, we do recognize that situation, and we recognize it's reasonable to have that because market is imperfect. Okay, why do we say market is imperfect? when we want to take advantage of a price differences of two countries, we want to buy from the cheaper place and then sell at the expensive place. And there would be transaction cost, there would be tariff, quote, shipping cost, all the legal cost, and even language barriers. It's not possible for an American citizen to fly to China just because the burger is half cheaper than U.S. It's not possible for a Norwegian to fly to U.S. just because our burger is half cheaper than their price. Okay, you can see there's a lot of restrictions for the free flow of products. So it's okay for that to happen. But the rate of change in prices should be similar when measured in common currency. All right. So in the relative form of PPP, we do realize the overvaluation and undervaluation is reasonable, but the level of overvaluation or undervaluation should remain the same when the price change in two different countries. Okay. So let me just give you an example here. Let's say I'm using Norwegian krone. All right. So let's say I still use a burger because that example is very easy. $1 in US and a 20 krone in Norway. All right, and then the actual exchange rate is $0.01 per krone. So that basically means if you buy a burger in Norway, that is going to cost you $2. Okay, so if you convert this Norwegian price into a dollar price, so that's a 20 krone multiplied by $0.01 per krone, it is going to be $2. So a burger costs $2 in Norway, but $1 in the United States. So how much is the overvaluation of the Norwegian krone? You need to calculate the PPP rate. So based on these two prices, okay, then we will see that the exchange $1 is equivalent to 20 krone when we use the burger as the intermediate commodity. So that's going to give us $0.05 per krone. And this is the PPP rate. Okay, it does not matter whether it's absolute or relative at this point. So it's the PPP rate. So how much is the overvaluation? Use the actual rate. Let me just mark this as actual rate to distinguish from the PPP rate. Actual minus the PPP divided by the PPP, so this would be 100%. Alrighty. Now let's look at the price level change. All right. So what about the two countries have a different price level? Let's say in Norway the inflation is 25%. To make things simple, I'm going to assume U.S. has zero inflation. So if that happens, then what would be the new Norwegian price for a burger? Okay. It used to be 20 krone. Now the price increased by 25%. So the new price would be how much? 25. Okay, it would be 25 krone. When dollar has 0% inflation, then it still will be $1. And under that new prices level, then you will see the new PPP rate here is $0.04 per krone. So you see the PPP rate actually reduced from 0.05 to 0.04. And the exchange rate should adjust at the same level. So the actual exchange rate, so under the relative form of a PPP, the actual rate would change by the same amount. So if that's the case, what should be the actual exchange rate? So let me just tell you this. You will use this formula as you practice. So the exchange rate in the next period, okay, let me use the spot rate in the next period. T stands for time. It equals to the exchange rate today, again, it's the spot rate today, multiplied by 1 plus the US inflation divided by 1 plus the foreign exchange inflation. In this case, that's the Norwegian inflation. All right. So if you do the calculation, the actual exchange rate was $0.01 per 1 krone. So you see that dollar is on the top, krone is down the bottom, and then you will multiply the dollar inflation on the top. That's very reasonable. And then down the bottom, you will multiply the krone inflation. Alrighty, and this is gonna give you $0.08 per krone. You can verify that number. Okay, so this formula will be tested, and how to use that formula, it's a very important part of this class. If I use this exchange rate, then what would happen to the undervaluation or overvaluation? So the actual rate has changed to 0.08 now, and the PPP rate is 0.04. That's the new one, divided by 0.04. That's the new overvaluation is still 100%, just like it was 100% before the inflation took place. Get back to the description of relative form of PPP. So it's okay for the market to be imperfect, to have all this shipping cost, transaction cost, so the prices in US and in Norway would be different. And it's okay to have the overvaluation of Norwegian krone by 100%. But the rate of a change in prices should be similar, okay, when measured in common currencies. Under the relative form of PPP, the rate of change in prices should be similar when measured in common currency. Okay, so get back to this Norwegian burger example. We have 0% in US for inflation and 25% for the inflation in Norway. And if we want to know what is the rate of a change in prices when measured in common currency, so we need to know what is the common currency we use here. We're using US dollar as a common currency. So what's the rate of a change in US for the burger price? Is 0%. It was $1, now it's still $1 just because inflation is 0. But what about the rate of a change in Norway when measured in dollar? Under the relative form of PPP, it is still need to be 0%. Okay, how can I verify this is 0%? Why do I know this is true? Okay, so this is the new price, the new local price in Norway, 25 krone, and this is the new exchange rate. So if you use 25 krone multiplied by the new exchange rate, that is going to give you $2. So it still will cost you $2 under the new local price, under the new local price, under the new exchange rate. Okay. So what was the dollar price earlier? The dollar price earlier was also $2. Okay. So from $2 here to the $2 here, we have the change of local price and exchange rate, but the dollar price of a Norwegian burger does not change. Okay, and this come back to this important formula. The exchange rate has to adjust for the inflation, so the relative form of a PPP would hold. And under the relative form of PPP, the amount of overvaluation and undervaluation is still the same as I proved earlier. Okay, so let me just write some keynotes here. So under the relative form of PPP, the dollar price, okay, just say the dollar prices plural change the same in two countries, in US and in another country, in a foreign country. All right, that's number one. Number two, the amount of over or undervaluation remains the same. And also, of course, the exchange rate, the actual exchange rate, actually both actual and the PPP exchange rate adjust to inflation. Okay, it should also be plural because we have inflation in US and the inflation in the foreign country. These are concepts you should know, and there are also calculations involved. For example, how to get the new exchange rate under the relative form of a PPP, and how to get the dollar price after inflation and actual rate changes, and how to get, again, the amount of overvaluation or undervaluation. So all of this could be tested in your quiz, in your exam. Okay, so here is one example. Suppose the spot rate is $1.25 per euro, which may be inconsistent under the absolute form of PPP. Of course, there is a overvaluation of euro for many years. But if we assume the relative form of PPP, then we should see that it is okay to have an overvaluation of euro just because market is imperfect. But under the relative form of PPP, the exchange rate should adjust for inflation, so the dollar price in the US and the dollar price in the euro change by the same amount, same percentage. Okay, so under the relative form of PPP, the exchange rate would adjust for inflation. $1.25 per euro, you can just write down a euro right here, exchange rate right now, okay? And you want to figure out what is the exchange rate later in 1 year. You will need to multiply 1 plus the US inflation over 1 plus the euro inflation. And in this case, US inflation is 3%, euro inflation is 5%. And then you can get your result as $1.23 per euro if you round it. Okay, and this is for the price, the exchange rate a year later. What about I ask you to calculate the exchange rate 2 years later, and then the inflation will be compounded. Then you will need to add an exponent of 2. So that's it. You will have a new exchange rate another year after. So it should be 1.25 multiplied by 1.03 raised to the power of 2 divided by 1.05 raised to the power of 2. So the answer would be 1.202. Okay, just $1.20 per euro. This is the exchange rate 2 years later, the spot rate, of course. And if I want to know the exchange rate 3 years later, if I want to find out the exchange rate 3 years later, then I will change the exponent from 2 to 3 and keep doing the same calculation over and again. So the change of exchange rate could be expressed as the exchange rate later minus exchange rate now divided by the exchange rate now. It is the definition of appreciation or depreciation. If the value is positive, that's appreciation, negative, depreciation. And also, we just developed this formula. The exchange rate in the next year equals to the exchange rate to this year multiplied by the home inflation over the foreign inflation. If we combine both equations, then we will have the exchange rate change would be the inflation ratio minus 1, okay? And of course, you add 1 to the numerator and the denominator, okay? So if we just simplify the PPP relationship, then we will see the exchange rate change happens to be the inflation differential, okay, or the difference between the inflation. So the inflation between US and the euro here is 2%, all right, it's 2%. And when the exchange rate change from 1.25 to 1.23, that's a negative 2% change. Okay, that's a negative 2% change. Well, if you really want to know the sign of the 2%, you should know it's the home inflation minus the foreign inflation. It should be negative 2%. And that basically means the euro will depreciate by 2% every year. And you can do another calculation from 1.23 to 1.20. It is another 2% depreciation of euro, and that once again come from this inflation difference between US and the Eurozone. I'm not going to spend time to prove how do I get this equation. It is approximate estimation. This is coming from the equation above. Just to keep in mind that the inflation differences would result in the exchange rate change. Okay, does that sound familiar? Let's say if US has lower inflation, the foreign country has higher inflation, which currency should depreciate. From the previous examples in Chapter 2, we learned that the country with higher inflation would have its currency depreciated. All right. In this case, it is the Eurozone has higher inflation, 2% higher than the United States, then the euro should depreciate by 2%. If we get into the details in this example, so if the Eurozone has higher inflation, okay, and the US inflation becomes relatively lower, so the euro price would be larger and the US price would be relatively lower in the eyes of the Europeans. And then the Europeans will buy more from US just because US price is lower, it's cheaper, and Americans will buy less from the Eurozone. So that indicates the US exports increases, and this indicates the US import decreases, or the euro import increases, or US export decreases. Okay, it's the same thing. So both of US export and euro import indicates euros buy from US, and both US import and the euro exports are indications of Americans buying from the Eurozone. Okay, so if the Europeans are buying more from the US, then they will need to convert euro to dollar, and that conversion increases. When Americans buy less from the Eurozone, then they will need to convert dollars to euros, and when they buy less, such conversion would become less. Okay, so if we want to focus on what happened to the value of a euro in the price of US dollars, then we will need to then you will need to know this is about selling euros, and this is about buying, and this is about buying euros, and this is a supply of euros, and this is a demand of euros. Okay, the supply increases, the demand decreases. So if you want to draw a chart, the quantity of euros here, the dollar price per euro, okay, is the price. So the demand decreases, the supply increases. When the demand decreases, it's moved to the left, and when supply increases, it moved to the right. Okay, so this would be the new equilibrium. So you will see that the new price is actually down for the value of euros. Okay, so euro depreciates. That's our final result. The euro value expressed in US dollar depreciates. So here is a summary of a purchasing power parity. Let's say US has a higher local inflation, then the US imports will increase because we have higher inflation. Our price is more expensive, their price is less expensive. We will buy more from them, from the less expensive place. So we will import more, but we will export less. And that would create a more supply of US dollar, a home currency, and a less demand of US dollar from the foreigners, and that's going to push our currency depreciate. Okay, so if we have a relatively lower local inflation, if the Europeans has higher inflation, then under the framework of import and export and the demand supply of euros, then their currency would be depreciated. Our US dollar should be appreciated. Okay, just like right here, when Eurozone has a higher inflation, euro depreciates, dollar appreciates. So you can also treat like this. When US has lower inflation, dollar appreciate. Relatively speaking, of course. If the inflation levels in two countries are the same, then there will be no pact on import or export, then there will be no currency value changes. And once again, the amount of exchange rate change, which is expressed in EF, okay, is expressed as the inflation difference. It is okay for the inflation to change and the exchange rate to adjust accordingly. sometimes the exchange rate just overreacted or the exchange rate underreacted. Okay, so if that's the case, then we will need to draw this diagram. You will see a 45-degree slope line. That's the purchasing power parity line. Right here, the exchange rate change would adjust to the inflation difference. So just like the formulas we covered earlier. Just like these formulas, the exchange rate would adjust for inflation difference, and the inflation difference would just be the change of exchange rate. Okay, the inflation difference would be the change of exchange rate. So let me just write it up here. Home minus foreign would be the change of the exchange rate under the relative form of PPP. As I said, sometimes the exchange rate would be too sensitive or too insensitive. For example, if the home inflation gets greater than the exchange rate, the home inflation is relatively higher. So that means home inflation is too high. Okay, and what would happen to the exchange rate? So the exchange rate should go up. So that means the home currency depreciate, the foreign exchange appreciate. So what would be the result? The exchange rate will go up, and this will maintain the same, and eventually the two sides converge. All right, so let me give you another situation. So what about if home country has an inflation that is too low compared to the change of the foreign exchange rate? Okay, so when the home inflation is too low, then that means the home currency will appreciate, then the foreign exchange will depreciate. So the right-hand side will go down to the depreciation of the foreign exchange. So eventually, this side and this side will converge. So in this chart, we have a point C right here. We also have a point D. So point C basically says that our inflation difference is 4%, and the exchange rate only changed by 1%, which is not consistent with the same rate of change. So our home inflation is just relatively too high. Then what would happen is the exchange rate will gradually change by more and more and make it equal to the inflation difference. In other words, when our inflation, the home inflation, is higher than the foreign inflation by 4%, the exchange rate should change by 4%, which is right here on the PPP line instead of at 1% level at point C. So this point C will gradually get to the PPP line. Okay, for point D, the answer is the same. It will gradually merge to the PPP line. For point D, our home inflation is relatively too low. You can see the difference is -3. So the foreign inflation is 3% higher than our home inflation. That's gonna make the foreign currency depreciate by 3%. At point D, the depreciation is only 2%, which is not enough. So the foreign currency will keep depreciating until it reaches to -3%, the exact amount of inflation difference between home and foreign.